At Crestwood Academy, one of the most expensive schools in Manhattan, perfection was expected. Children of senators, tech billionaires, and Hollywood stars filled the classrooms, their futures mapped out before they could even drive. But there was one boy who didn't fit the mold, even though on paper he should have been the shining star of the school. His name was Ethan Caldwell. Ethan wasn't just another student. He was the son of Richard Caldwell, a real estate tycoon who practically owned half the skyline of New York City. Richard was a man known for his relentless drive, his iron will, and his obsession with success. In his world, failure wasn't an option. It was an insult, which is why Ethan's grades were more than just a disappointment. They were, in Richard's eyes, a disgrace. Ethan had everything money could buy: private tutors, the newest laptop, a room stacked with expensive gadgets, and vacations to places his classmates could only dream of. But when it came to schoolwork, he carried a secret shame. He failed, over and over. His report cards were filled with zeros and failing marks. It didn't matter how many times his father yelled, or how many times teachers insisted he try harder. The numbers never changed. That Monday morning, the math teacher walked slowly between the rows of desks, handing back tests. The air was thick with tension as students craned their necks to see their scores. When the teacher dropped Ethan's test on his desk, his tone carried exhaustion. "Another zero, Caldwell." The words weren't shouted, but they echoed anyway. The snickers started immediately. A boy from the back muttered just loud enough, "Guess Daddy's money can't buy a brain." Laughter followed. Ethan forced a smirk, the mask he wore whenever humiliation hit him in public. He grabbed the test, folded it, and shoved it deep into his bag without even looking at the red ink that screamed across the page. Inside, though, he was burning. He wanted to shout that he wasn't stupid. He wanted to explain that the numbers blurred on the page, that his brain froze the moment he saw equations, that every test felt like drowning in a language he couldn't read. But saying that out loud would only make things worse. So he did what he always did, pretended not to care. At lunch, Ethan sat alone in the far corner of the courtyard, away from the noise. He pulled the crumpled test from his bag. The bright zero mocked him, bold and merciless. Underneath, the teacher had written the same tired comments. "Not enough effort, needs focus." He wanted to rip the paper to shreds. Instead, he stuffed it back down, angry at himself for even looking. What Ethan didn't realize was that someone had been watching. Not a teacher, not a classmate, but the school custodian, Mrs. Ramirez. To most of the students, Mrs. Ramirez didn't exist. She pushed her cart through the hallways with a mop and bucket, replaced trash liners, and scrubbed the chalk dust off the floors. She wore the same faded blue uniform every day, her hair pulled back into a bun, her hands cracked from years of cleaning. Kids brushed past her like she was part of the furniture. Some mocked her accent. Others didn't bother to learn her name. But her eyes saw more than anyone gave her credit for. She saw Ethan. She had noticed how he walked the halls with his head tilted just high enough to look arrogant, but his shoulders slumped when no one was watching. She had seen him toss test papers into the trash, his jaw clenched. She had noticed how he sat alone, picking at his food, his expensive sneakers tapping restlessly on the floor. And in those moments, Mrs. Ramirez saw not the son of a billionaire, but just another kid lost in his own storm. That Friday, the hallways buzzed with chatter as students rushed for the weekend. Ethan stumbled down the stairs, his backpack slipping from his shoulder. A notebook fell, spilling pages across the floor. Some kids laughed and stepped over it. Others kicked a sheet or two aside as they passed. Mrs. Ramirez bent down quickly, gathering the scattered pages before they could be ruined. She paused when her eyes landed on them. The notebook wasn't filled with schoolwork, but with sketches. Detailed drawings of cars, futuristic buildings, even maps of imaginary cities. Among the doodles were fragments of lyrics, story ideas, half-written thoughts. It was chaotic, messy, but brilliant in its own way. She looked up at Ethan as she handed the notebook back. "You know," she said quietly, "sometimes it's not about being smarter, It's about finding the right way to use what you already have. Ethan froze, startled. No one had ever spoken to him like that, not his father, not his teachers, not even his so-called friends. Words from a janitor? He wanted to brush them off, to laugh it away. But something in her tone made it impossible. There was no judgment in her voice, only certainty. He snatched the notebook, muttered, "Thanks," and walked away. But that night, as he sat in his enormous bedroom filled with all the luxuries money could buy, he flipped through the sketches again. Her words echoed in his mind. Find the right way to use what you already have. For the first time, Ethan wondered if maybe he wasn't broken. Maybe he just hadn't found his way yet. That single thought sparked something in him, something small but powerful. And though he didn't know it yet, that moment, those few words from the woman everyone ignored, would change not only his grades, but his entire life. Because sometimes the greatest wisdom doesn't come from the people at the top. Sometimes it comes from the ones no one sees. And Ethan was about to learn that lesson in the most unexpected way. If you want to know what happens when a billionaire's son discovers the secret to unlocking his true potential, not from his father or his teachers, but from the janitor everyone overlooked, make sure to hit the like button, subscribe to this channel, and stay with us until the end. The next part of this story will surprise you. The following week at Crestwood Academy unfolded like every other. Classes filled with pressure, students rushing between lockers, and teachers carrying the weight of high expectations. But for Ethan, something had shifted. He couldn't shake the words Mrs. Ramirez had spoken to him. They clung to his thoughts, interrupting the usual soundtrack of self-doubt. During history class, while others scribbled notes, Ethan opened his notebook to a blank page. Instead of drawing cars or buildings, he tried something different. He wrote "Problem, Small Steps." It looked childish at first, but it reminded him of what Mrs. Ramirez had hinted at, breaking down what seemed overwhelming into smaller pieces. He stared at a homework question about the American Revolution. Normally, he'd skip it entirely. This time, he wrote, Step 1, who, Step 2, when, Step 3, why. He didn't finish the assignment perfectly, but for the first time in months, he actually completed something. At lunch, he saw Mrs. Ramirez cleaning near the cafeteria doors. She glanced up and caught his eye. "Did you try?" she asked softly. He shrugged, embarrassed, but she could tell from his expression that he had. She smiled and kept mopping as if nothing more needed to be said. That quiet acknowledgement was enough to fuel him for the rest of the day. Still, change didn't come overnight. Ethan's math teacher returned another test later that week. This time, Ethan didn't earn a 0, but a 54%. For most students, it would have been failure. For Ethan, it was proof that maybe he wasn't doomed to be the school joke forever. He carried the paper home in his backpack like it was a treasure. When Richard Caldwell saw the grade, though, his reaction was far from celebratory. 54? He barked. You think this is an improvement? Barely half the questions right? Ethan clenched his fists, ready for the familiar sting of humiliation. But instead of backing down, he said quietly, "It's better than 0. Richard froze, stunned by his son's defiance. For a moment, he saw not just a struggling teenager, but a boy clawing for some recognition, some respect. Yet pride and stubbornness kept Richard silent. He tossed the paper on the table and muttered, "Better isn't good enough." Then he left the room. Ethan sat alone, staring at the paper. Anger swelled in his chest, but so did determination. For the first time, he wasn't crushed by his father's disappointment. He thought of Mrs. Ramirez's steady eyes and her voice telling him that his ideas were gold, waiting to be shaped. He whispered to himself, "I'll show him. I'll show all of them." The next morning, Ethan arrived at school earlier than usual. He found Mrs. Ramirez wiping down the stair rails before the rush of students. He walked up awkwardly, holding his notebook. "I tried," he said, flipping it open to show her the steps he'd written. "It sort of worked." She looked at the scribbles, then back at him. "Good," she said simply. "Now try again." It wasn't encouragement in the way teachers praised or parents pressured. It was something different, steady, grounded, as if she knew he could do more and wouldn't let him stop halfway. Ethan nodded and walked away, strangely proud that she had expected more of him. Over the next weeks, a pattern formed. Every time Ethan felt overwhelmed, he would quietly repeat to himself, "Break it down, divide it, try again." Some nights he stayed up later than usual, scribbling problems into his notebook, practicing step after step until the answers began to make sense. He wasn't perfect. He still failed here and there, but failure no longer felt like the end. It felt like part of the process. One afternoon, while studying in the library, Ethan overheard a group of boys whispering about him. "Caldwell thinks he's smart now. Got a 50. Big deal." Laughter followed. For once, Ethan didn't feel the sting. Instead, he pulled out his notes and kept working. He realized their words didn't define him anymore. Mrs. Ramirez noticed the difference too. She often caught glimpses of him bent over his notebook, lips moving as he worked through problems. She never hovered, never preached, but once in a while she would pause as she swept and say things like, "Mistakes are just signposts," or "You don't build a skyscraper all at once, you lay one brick at a time." Ethan started writing those lines in the margins of his notebook, like secret codes only he and she understood. At home, Richard remained distant, unaware of how much his son was changing. He still believed expensive tutors or stricter punishments would be the answer. But Ethan no longer relied on his father's approval. He found pride in his own progress, however small. Then came the day of the midterm exams. Ethan sat at his desk, palms sweating, heart pounding. Normally, this was when panic set in and everything turned blank. But this time, he pulled out a scrap of paper where he had written Mrs. Ramirez's words. Step by step. Break it down. Don't quit. He breathed deeply, then began. One problem at a time. One step at a time. Hours later, when the results were posted, Ethan's hands trembled as he searched for his name. Beside it was the number 78. For most kids at Crestwood, it was average. For Ethan, it was a miracle. His chest swelled with pride he had never felt before. That afternoon, he spotted Mrs. Ramirez in the hallway carrying a bucket. Without thinking, he rushed up to her, holding out the paper. 78, he said breathlessly. She looked at the score, then at him, her face breaking into a smile. See? You had it all along. You just needed to believe it. For the first time, Ethan hugged her. It was quick, awkward, but full of gratitude. She patted his shoulder gently. Now keep going, she said. This is only the beginning. That evening, when Richard read the report, he frowned. 78? Still not an A. But this time, Ethan didn't care. For the first time, he wasn't chasing his father's approval. He was chasing his own potential. And what neither Ethan nor Richard yet understood was that Mrs. Ramirez's simple wisdom would ripple far beyond grades. It would shape the way Ethan faced life itself. Weeks passed, and the transformation in Ethan's life began to ripple outward. It wasn't just his test scores that were changing. It was the way he carried himself. He walked into class with his head higher, spoke less defensively to teachers, and even started answering questions aloud. For the first time, classmates who used to mock him began to notice something was different. Some still whispered behind his back, but the sharp sting of their words didn't pierce him anymore. One afternoon, Ethan stayed late in the library, bent over his notebook. He was working on a science assignment, diagramming the water cycle in small, broken-down steps the way Mrs. Ramirez had shown him. A younger student walked by, glanced at the page, and asked timidly, "How do you do that?" "I never get it right." Ethan hesitated. For years, he had been the one asking for help, the one lost in the fog. But now he picked up his pencil and explained, "You just split it into parts. Don't think of the whole thing, just one piece at a time." The boy nodded wide-eyed. "That actually makes sense." He walked away smiling, and Ethan sat stunned. For the first time in his life, he had explained something to someone else, and it worked. Meanwhile, Richard remained blind to the quiet revolution happening in his son's life. Business consumed him. He traveled to board meetings, cut deals, appeared on magazine covers. At home, his conversations with Ethan were brief, often limited to "How was school?" and "Work harder." He didn't notice the way Ethan stayed up later with his notebook, or how his once messy desk was now organized with sticky notes, steps written in block letters across them. But Mrs. Ramirez noticed. Every day as she cleaned classrooms, she saw him working, erasing, trying again, and each time she'd offer a small nod of approval that fueled him more than any lecture could. Then came the spring science fair, a tradition at Crestwood Academy. Students were expected to design projects and present them before a panel of teachers and parents. For most, it was just another chance to impress. For Ethan, it was a battlefield, one he never thought he'd survive. He had failed at every project in the past, often copying ideas last minute, earning ridicule. But this year, Mrs. Ramirez's words echoed in his head. What you have inside is gold. You just need to shape it. Instead of copying, Ethan opened his sketch-filled notebook. He flipped through designs he had once dismissed as nonsense. Machines, contraptions, diagrams of cars and towers. An idea sparked. He chose to build a simple model of a water filtration system, inspired by one of his messy drawings. He researched, step by step, how to construct it using affordable materials. Over 2 weeks, his room became a workshop, plastic bottles and tubing scattered across the floor. He struggled, failed, and rebuilt. And each time he felt like quitting, he heard Mrs. Ramirez's voice reminding him, mistakes are signposts. On the day of the fair, Crestwood's gymnasium buzzed with excitement. Rows of polished projects stood proudly, solar panels, robotic arms, digital apps. Ethan's table looked humble in comparison. A homemade filtration system made from bottles, sand, and charcoal. Students laughed as they passed by. That's it? Looks like trash in a bottle. Ethan clenched his fists, but stayed quiet. He had learned not to let mockery steal his resolve. When the judges approached, Ethan demonstrated his project. He poured dirty water into the top, and slowly clear water dripped out the bottom. The judges raised their eyebrows. "This is practical," one said. "Simple, but effective. Where did you get the idea?" Ethan hesitated, then admitted, "From doodles in my notebook. I just broke it down into steps until it worked." The judges exchanged impressed looks. "Not bad, Caldwell. Not bad at all." He didn't win first place. That went to a polished robotics project. But he received an honorable mention, something he had never dreamed of. To him, that small ribbon felt heavier than gold. He tucked it into his pocket and carried it home like treasure. That evening, Richard noticed the ribbon pinned to his son's backpack. "What's this?" he asked. "You win something?" Ethan nodded cautiously. "Science fair. I got honorable mention." Richard smirked. "Not first place?" Ethan braced for disappointment, but instead of shame, he felt a strange calm. "No, but I built it myself, and it worked." He walked away, leaving Richard staring after him. For the first time, Richard wondered if his son was becoming someone he didn't fully understand. The turning point came a week later during parent-teacher conferences. Richard arrived at the school in his tailored suit, shaking hands with teachers who spoke highly of his son's recent progress. "Ethan has been applying himself," his math teacher explained. "His improvement is remarkable. He's even helping other students." Richard nodded, but his mind raced. Helping others? Ethan? He couldn't reconcile the boy he had always scolded with the one being described. When the meeting ended, Richard walked down the corridor and unexpectedly spotted Mrs. Ramirez wiping a bulletin board. For reasons he couldn't explain, he stopped. "You're Mrs. Ramirez, aren't you?" She nodded politely. "Yes, sir. Can I help you?" Richard studied her. She was small, older, her hands rough from years of cleaning. Nothing about her matched the world of wealth he lived in. And yet there was something steady in her eyes. "My son, Ethan, he mentioned your name." She smiled gently. "He's a good boy. He just needed someone to see him differently." Richard cleared his throat, suddenly uncomfortable. "So you've been tutoring him?" "No," she said firmly. "I didn't teach him answers. I only showed him how to believe in himself. The rest was him." Richard didn't know what to say. He was a man who bought results, who measured value in numbers and contracts. And here was a woman who had achieved what all his expensive investments had failed to do unlock his son's potential with nothing but patience and wisdom. For the first time in years, Richard felt humbled. That night, Ethan found his father sitting in the living room, staring at the ribbon from the science fair. Richard looked up and said quietly, "I met Mrs. Ramirez today." Ethan's heart jumped. He wasn't sure if his father would mock him or forbid him from talking to her. But instead, Richard continued, "She told me something I should have told you a long time ago, that you're capable, that you're more than your grades." Ethan didn't know how to respond. For years he had longed to hear those words, and though his father struggled to say them, they landed heavy with meaning. The bond between father and son didn't heal overnight, but slowly, Richard began to show up differently. He asked Ethan about his projects. He listened more. He even started joining him at the table in the evenings, not to scold, but to sit quietly while Ethan worked. Ethan still leaned on Mrs. Ramirez for encouragement, but now he sensed that his father was trying too, in his own awkward way. By the end of the school year, Ethan's report card was the best he had ever received. No zeros, no failures, just steady, solid grades. Not perfect, but proof of progress. Proof that he had learned not just facts, but resilience. And though no one announced it, the quiet truth was undeniable. The janitor's simple words had changed the trajectory of a billionaire's son. Summer arrived with heavy heat pressing down on the city, but inside the Caldwell household, there was a new atmosphere that had little to do with weather. Ethan was no longer the boy who hid his grades in shame. His notebooks were filled with organized steps, diagrams, and even new inventions he was sketching with enthusiasm. Where once there had been despair, there was now persistence. Richard noticed the difference every time he glanced into his son's room. The boy he once called a disappointment now spent evenings with pencil in hand, face determined, working through challenges without giving up. One evening, Richard lingered by the doorway longer than usual. He watched Ethan solve a problem, erase, try again, and then finally punch the air in victory when the answer clicked. Richard cleared his throat, embarrassed to be caught staring. "Good job," he muttered before walking away. Ethan didn't answer, but he smiled quietly, knowing those two words from his father meant more than years of criticism ever had. By mid-July, Crestwood Academy released its annual honor roll. To nearly everyone's shock, Ethan Caldwell's name appeared on the list. Not at the top, but there nonetheless. For Ethan, that single line printed in black ink was proof that he was no longer defined by failure. When he saw it pinned on the bulletin board, he didn't rush to hide. He stood there, reading it again and again, almost afraid it would vanish. His classmates whispered. Some were surprised, some skeptical, but no one could deny the evidence. For the first time, Ethan wasn't the butt of jokes. He was the subject of curiosity. "How did you do it?" a boy asked in the cafeteria. Ethan shrugged. "I learned to break things down, one step at a time." They laughed at how simple it sounded, but deep down, a few of them tried it later and realized he wasn't lying. Richard heard about the honor roll through a congratulatory email from the principal. He read it 3 times, stunned. That night, he invited Ethan to dinner at a quiet restaurant, something they hadn't done in years. Over plates of steak and potatoes, Richard set down his fork and said, "I'm proud of you." Ethan froze. He had imagined those words 1,000 times, but never expected to hear them. "Thanks," he managed, his voice trembling slightly. Richard leaned forward. "I know I pushed you too hard. I thought money and the best schools were enough. But it took someone else to remind me that what you needed was belief, not pressure." Ethan studied his father's face. For the first time, he saw not the flawless billionaire, but a man trying. Clumsy, late, but trying. And that meant more than perfection ever could. As the school year closed, the principal announced a small ceremony to recognize students who had shown the most improvement. Parents filled the auditorium, their murmurs echoing under the high ceiling. When Ethan's name was called, he walked onto the stage to polite applause. His father stood in the crowd, clapping louder than anyone. Ethan accepted the certificate, heart racing, and spotted Mrs. Ramirez in the back, her uniform smudged from a day's work, but her smile brighter than the lights overhead. Their eyes met, and Ethan gave a subtle nod, a silent acknowledgement that she had been the one to spark this journey. Later, when the ceremony ended, Richard approached Mrs. Ramirez. "I owe you," he admitted. "No," she corrected softly. "You owe your son. He did the work. I just reminded him he could." Richard hesitated, then extended his hand. "Still, thank you. You did what I couldn't." She shook his hand firmly, then returned to stacking chairs without ceremony, as though saving a boy's future were no more extraordinary than sweeping a floor. The months passed, and Ethan continued to climb. By the following year, his grades were steady, his confidence stronger. He no longer defined himself by wealth or failure, but by effort. He joined the robotics club, surprising everyone with his creative ideas. His once messy doodles turned into blueprints, his restless energy channeled into building and problem-solving. Teachers began to describe him not as a troubled student, but as innovative. Richard, meanwhile, found himself reflecting on the journey often. In his office, lined with expensive art and shelves of awards, he realized none of it had brought him the pride he felt when his son showed him a solved math problem or a model robot. The millionaire who had measured life in profits was slowly learning that true wealth was the growth of a child who refused to give up. The defining moment came at Ethan's next parent night. This time, Richard walked in with his shoulders less rigid, his gaze softer. The teachers praised Ethan's progress, but what struck Richard most was hearing how his son now helped others. "He's patient," one teacher said. "He tells kids not to give up, that mistakes are part of learning." Richard swallowed hard. His son wasn't just improving, he was passing on the wisdom given to him. When they left the building, Ethan walked beside his father in silence until Richard finally said, "You've become someone I admire." Ethan blinked, stunned. "Me? Admire?" Richard nodded. "Yes, you taught me that resilience matters more than perfection, and I learned that from you." As the years moved forward, Ethan carried those lessons into everything he did. College applications came, and though he wasn't top of the class, he earned acceptance letters through determination and essays about overcoming failure. When he graduated, Richard sat in the crowd, clapping until his hands hurt, tears in his eyes as he remembered the boy who once crumpled tests into trash. After the ceremony, Ethan found Mrs. Ramirez waiting outside, older now, but still smiling. He hugged her fiercely. "I wouldn't be here without you." She shook her head. "You did it, Ethan. You just needed someone to remind you that you could. Never forget to be that reminder for someone else." And he never did. For the rest of his life, Ethan remembered the janitor who had taught him that failure wasn't the end. It was just another step. He remembered his father learning, at last, that wealth could never buy what true belief could create. And he carried forward the truth that saved him: resilience, faith in oneself, and the courage to keep trying. Because in the end, the richest inheritance Ethan ever received wasn't money. It was a lesson whispered in a quiet hallway by a woman everyone overlooked but who saw everything clearly. And now I want to ask you, the one listening to this story, what about you? Have you ever had someone believe in you when you didn't believe in yourself? Or maybe you've been that person for someone else. Share your story in the comments, tell us from where in the world you're watching, and let us know how this lesson speaks to you. If Ethan's journey inspired you, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe, and share this video with someone who needs a reminder that failure is never the end. The next story might be the one that changes your life too.